morning. It's my honor to welcome with us today Dr. Gregory Miller, author of Sun Tzu in Space, to the NSSI here in Colorado Springs. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak to our faculty and staff regarding your book, and also joining us here for our fireside chat to share in person some of the insight you've given to our faculty and staff, to our wider space community. My name is Captain Jared Hammer. I am the Dean for the College of Space Warfare here at the NSSI, partnered with the United States Space Command to meet the education needs for our joint and coalition warfighters. So we'll go and get started. I understand you are an educator as well. Tell us a little bit about your background and some of your experience in this field.
So I have spent 20 years teaching. I got my PhD in political science about 20 years ago, taught for 10 years in the civilian world, teaching in a couple different universities. Joined the Department of Defense in 2013, started teaching, and have been teaching in professional military education ever since. I'm currently the Dean of Space Education, which means I help sort of run the Schriever and West Space Scholar programs, which are our Space Force ILE and SLE programs at Johns Hopkins University.
Thank you. So what prompted you to write this book?
It really was an effort to combine all the things that I'm interested in, space, international relations, strategy, into a book that I could really kind of see using in a PME course, but also maybe even more importantly, talking to people who in these different communities don't necessarily talk to each other. So international relations scholars, being able to engage science fiction enthusiasts as well as space professionals, and also helping people in those other fields who maybe don't have a background in international relations, trying to get a grasp of what the future might look like based on where we've been in the past.
So Sun Tzu in Space, what inspired the title?
It was one of those things that just kind of came to me, and like a lot of my work, the book started with the title and then kind of formed over time what it became. I don't have a insight into the origins of the title. It's just, in the shower or waking up one morning and it's like, Sun Tzu in Space, that's a book that needs to be written. I'll do it. And it originally was it was going to be how does the art of war apply today in the space domain? But as I started writing it, that wasn't the book I wanted to write. Like I said, I wanted it to be more of sort of an international relations textbook type of book, but engaging those other fields. So Sun Tzu in Space kind of stuck around. It got cemented. The publisher liked it and didn't want to deviate once it became kind of a different book. But I think that's the hook that gets a lot of people to at least look at the book is the title.
Absolutely. So in your book, you detail 7 scenarios that are based on a number of worldviews. What influenced you to select these specific socio-political worldviews?
Well, I started with the 3 international relations worldviews that are most commonly taught in courses: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And then sort of branched out and said, what else would be in an international relations textbook? And I went on to other things like Marxism and feminism, and a couple of other things that ended up not making into the book in much detail, like the English school. But once I had kind of this list of IR worldviews, I said, what can I tell a story about? What of these can actually inform what might happen in the future? What can I write a short story, fiction short story, as a scenario that would kind of illustrate these worldviews? And so I weeded out a couple that I didn't think I'd be able to work with. And at the same time, with the realism and liberalism, it occurred to me that there was just so much content in those 2 worldviews that I really needed 2 chapters on each of them. So realism, I broke up into offensive and defensive realism. Liberalism, I break up into sort of the institutions focus of liberalism and then the more economic focus of liberalism. So it was, if I was going to go back and teach an IR theory course in a university and tie it to space or science fiction, that's sort of how I would structure the course, is in those 7 chapters. So that's really the gist of it.
So in your book, what are the main themes?
Um, so there's a lot. There's a lot packed into this book. You can tell by the subtitle. It's international relations history, science fiction. There's also strategy and political violence and those kinds of things. I think the main lessons are that we can learn from our history, and if we want to be able to guide the future of humanity, we need to learn some of those lessons and not make the same mistakes. The historians always say that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I like to say you never walk into the same river exactly the same, but you might slip in the same spot. And so that's the real big lesson. We need to learn from our history, but also the science fiction part of it. The fascinating thing to me as a fan of science fiction is the best works take current problems or current scenarios and try to solve them by applying them in a different domain or at a different time. And if we can actually draw a lot of lessons from science fiction about what's the future that we want versus the one that we don't want. And so my goal in trying to tie it, those existing scenarios in science fiction to the historical record is there's a path for a future that we might want as a humanity, as a human race. But there's also a lot of paths that we probably don't want, and we need to avoid going down those roads. I end up getting to kind of a conclusion where the best outcome for humanity is one that focuses on a sort of neoliberal institutionalist worldview, right? Cooperation is not just possible, but beneficial to a majority of people. I'm a little skeptical that that's going to be the future we end up with, because I'm at heart maybe a little bit of a realist, but in kind of working through these scenarios somewhat systematically and applying a little bit of rigor to outcomes that each would provide in terms of national interest, economic security, science and technology advances. I think I've convinced even myself that liberalist future is a much better outcome. It's just, I don't know that we're going to get there. But if that's the one we want, we need to look at the past and see what were the mistakes we made that led us down those other paths.
Right. That actually leads into my next question. Which scenario of the scenarios you present do you feel is most likely, or do you feel reality will reflect combinations of these scenarios?
The reality is these 7 scenarios tied to each worldview are kind of archetypes, right? They're a little extreme in being able to illustrate the main concepts of the worldviews. So I think the most likely scenario in the future is going to be a mix of some of them. Some of them may be a little more plausible than others. But it's you never expect the Spanish Inquisition. You don't know what the future is going to hold. So, right now, maybe the least plausible scenario is the AI one, where AI just kind of governs everything we do. But there's no reason to believe that's not at least a possibility, right? Another one is the feminist chapter is a future where basically all of space is controlled by women. Not just controlled by women, but men are not involved. That seems implausible, but not impossible, right? And there may be a handful of people that want that future. So the book is maybe a little bit of a guide to get there or to avoid it if we don't want. But yeah, I think the reality is it'll be some mix of all of these or something we haven't even anticipated that sort of takes us in a completely different direction. One of the things I don't get into in this book really much is the possibility of alien encounters, right? And you probably don't want to go down that path in here, but that's been a common comment about the book from science fiction people is, how would that change any of these scenarios if you actually assumed aliens? Maybe that's the next book.
There we go. So at the beginning of each of your chapters, you create your own scenario, which is in its form somewhat science fiction. Have you considered expanding any of those fictional scenarios into standalone stories of their own, or do you consider them to be more academic thought experiments?
Initially, they were just thought experiments. I have toyed with the idea of expanding a couple of them that I really kind of got attached to and think would be books that I would want to read. I don't have a ton of extra time and energy, and I've written some science fiction short stories in the past that I won't show anybody because I'm, as an academic, I'm comfortable showing people my work. As a science fiction author, I'm not a science fiction author. So I'm not comfortable with that idea yet. I may down the road just throw caution to the wind and write a short story based on one of those scenarios and expand it a little bit, maybe a novelette or something like that, or novella. But yeah, it's something I would be interested in doing. I don't have the time right now, and given my day job and all the things that I'm doing, but there are definitely a couple of those scenarios that I think would be interesting stories.
So most of your scenarios involve significant conflict, either post-expansion as competition for resources or pre-expansion as catalyst for unification and expansion. Do you see conflict as inevitable, or do you think the world can move past our historical tendencies and peacefully spread throughout the solar system?
I mean, this gets back to the realism liberalism divide. Really, is the pessimist in me and the person who wrote this book is sort of that realist approach, right? That conflict is always a possibility, and given human history, that's hard to refute. There are obviously examples where states have been able to cooperate even for long periods of time. You look at NATO, you look at the European Union. So it is possible. I have a hard time believing that global cooperation could occur in the absence of something that just is so tragic it changes our perspective. And so I want to believe that we could get to a point where we all recognize the value of cooperation to humanity and to all of our interests. In my heart, I don't know that we'll ever get there. I'm definitely more of a liberalist now, especially since focusing on space and writing this book. I spent the first 15 years of my academic career studying terrorism and just saw the worst in humanity and no solutions to really any of the problems there. And that's one of the reasons I started kind of going back to studying space. Is it's more optimistic. You follow people on social media that do space, and they firmly believe that they will solve all these problems by going to space. And it's hard to be pessimistic in that kind of arena. So I'm definitely more of a liberalist optimist now than I used to be. But I still, in my heart, don't necessarily trust humanity to make the right decisions.
Right. So do you feel like your role as a military educator in the United States influenced how some of your scenarios played out? For example, the result of a Marxist society, or did you try to maintain as impartial as possible when predicting outcomes?
I tried to be as impartial as possible, and one of the things maybe I didn't spell out well enough in the book is I wasn't trying to predict outcomes. I was trying to take the international relations worldview and say, okay, if this worldview is right, what's a likely future going to look like just based on that thread of logic and the assumptions that they make in that worldview. And so I wasn't necessarily saying this is the way it's going to be if there's a realist leadership in the world. But it's just given realist assumptions, given realist history, this is a likely scenario. And so I really tried to maintain a very neutral approach. Again, when I started out this project, I was more of a realist than I am at the end. And I think I attribute that to really taking a neutral stance. I wasn't trying to make one of these worldviews more sort of positive or more beneficial. It's just based on these worldviews, views of the world. It's those scenarios I think are plausible, at least. Now, one of the things I might do differently if I were going to rewrite this book, although it would probably add another 200 pages, which my publisher wouldn't like, is instead of just one scenario, maybe multiple scenarios where there's like a worst case scenario based on these worldviews and a best case scenario based on these worldviews, and then compare those. And that might have given me different results, although I'm not sure. I don't know if that answers your question. The military side of me, I wasn't really thinking in those terms. I wasn't trying to write it for a purely military audience or to challenge military convention or anything like that. It was meant to be more of an academic exercise. But I think it resonates with a military audience because of the Sun Tzu concept, because it does bring in a lot of different ideas and concepts.
So that relates actually to the next question. In hindsight, what would you change about your book, if anything? Is there anything in the scenarios you feel would play out differently given the current world environment?
I don't think I would have changed anything substantively. Like I said, I might do worst case, best case scenarios in each chapter, or at least in a couple of the chapters where it was appropriate. I don't think I necessarily would have changed the scenarios that are in there now. I don't think there's any need to change the international relations discussions that are in there. There's always more science fiction I could have added to those parts of each chapter to kind of tie things together. But at some point, I think I make the points that I'm trying to make in each of those chapters with the science fiction that I use. I somewhat joke that if I had to do it again, I might change the title of the book. I joke that it's neither about Sun Tzu or space, but it's good marketing, right? And it's what attracts people to the book or hooks them to it at least. But the connections to Sun Tzu are there, but it's not a big part of the book. There's not a lot of space in it for like space professionals to really draw from. There's not a lot of space power theory in it. And so if I were going to do it again, I might incorporate more space power theories, Joan Johnson, Freeze, Clay Moltz, Ev Dolman, Brent Zarnick, folks like that. That wasn't my intent of the book. But now that it's out, now that people in PME are interested in it, we use it as an optional reading in our courses. There might be benefit to having more space in it. Maybe that's the next book, Sun Tzu 2, Sun Tzu Part 2. But yeah, I don't know that I would change a whole lot with it. I'm happy with it. If I were to change the title, I don't know what a better title would be. So I kind of go back and forth on that. But no, I don't think I would have changed a whole lot of content.
Okay. Have you considered a sequel that explores other worldviews or potential scenarios?
The sequel I'm thinking about right now is more of a practical application of the ideas in there. So it's more getting into the actual strategy. If there's a future scenario we want, how do we actually get there? As opposed to just let's look at the past, let's look at science fiction and see if we can, what are the steps that we could actually implement to get there, either as a country, as a race, as a DoD, right? Getting more into the operationalizing it a little bit. As soon as I have time, that's the book I'm going to write. I don't know if it will have scenarios in it. It might kind of tie it into that first book. It might build on the scenarios that are in that first book and expand them a little bit. I don't know. It's still kind of rolling around in my head and not really on paper yet, other than, a working title, but we'll see.
So what's next on your agenda?
Just professionally or in terms of writing?
Both.
Professionally right now, most of my effort is getting this independent Space Force PME to a place that we want it to be. I want it to be a world-class program that sister service international officers and guardians want to come to and that Space Force is proud of. We just graduated our first class from the Johns Hopkins University Program Partnership. And so that a lot of my effort is going towards that, both on the sort of administrative leadership side and the teaching side. As far as scholarship, I'm working on a bunch of different projects. I do have a couple of papers I'm working on that tie international relations and strategy to the three-body problem and to science fiction in general. So I'm still kind of doing that niche that I've sort of created for myself. Not created, but fallen down into. But I've got a couple other projects I'm working on. One of my international relations projects a while ago. My first book was focused on international reputations and how that affects partnerships and alliances. And I'm working on a paper that kind of ties that into space, how the U.S. Reliability as a space partner affects our ability to get folks to join, like Artemis or other things that we're working on. And then I'm part of a Minerva grant research team that is looking at governance in cislunar space, which ties into this book a lot. Is how do we establish the rules of behavior and the norms that we want to influence behavior in cislunar space and beyond? And we're looking at different states' interest in the UN and that kind of thing, and sort of trying to identify how do we get to a governance regime that we want on the lunar surface or beyond. So those are kind of my big projects. I do want to write another book that sort of builds on this one or takes it in a slightly different way, but we'll see.
That's awesome. We look forward to it.
Me too.
So do you mind expanding a little bit about the role of science fiction in your book and also in your professional life as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. Science fiction, I've been a fan of science fiction since I was a kid. I got away from it a lot in my early career because I felt like I didn't have time. But when I started teaching about future war and technology and things like that, it got me really interested in space, and that got me back into science fiction. And the ironic thing is, as I started reading more science fiction, it actually helped me formulate more ideas for research projects and papers and this book. And so if nothing else, just reading anything, but for me, somebody who studies space and thinks about space, science fiction has direct connections to those kinds of concepts. And I struggle with, there's sort of this side joke that, science fiction is fake, right? It's not space. It's not what we do. But there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of things we can draw from science fiction. Like I said, the best science fiction takes current problems and puts them in a different perspective and tries to solve them, or at least better understand them. And I think we can learn a lot from that. I taught a course at ACSE on science fiction and strategy, where students would read novels, science fiction novels, and we talk about how they apply to strategic concepts like leadership, ethics, civ-mil relations. And I got a lot out of that class. I hope the students did. But I think what science fiction really does is it highlights the challenges that we have as a society, as a human race, and gives us a way forward to potentially solving some of those problems. And I think that if we put aside this notion that, well, that's fiction, it's not true, and focus more on education is about expanding our ideas, expanding our perspectives, seeing different perspectives. And science fiction can really do that in a way that maybe no other fiction can, or even reading nonfiction can in many cases. So for me, science fiction is a critical part of how I think about the future of space, how I sort of generate some of my research ideas, even the ones that are not related to the future or space. But it's really about expanding our minds, expanding the way we think about the world, understanding different perspectives.
A lot of your scenarios begin several decades into the future at the minimum, sometimes much further out. What should we do now as a society? How do you envision the near term to influence what we do in the long term?
I think the biggest thing is we have to figure out what we want. We really don't have, just talking about the United States as for right now, we really don't have a national vision for what we want in space, what we want to do in space. And that, it gets tied into budget and politics and American public understanding of what they could gain from space. We tend to overestimate what we spend on space and underestimate what we get from it. And so there's always this sort of challenge to the political will to do space. And I think if we can first identify what it is we want in space, do we want a sort of Ev Dolman type of American hegemony? Do we want exploration to ensure that we're not all on one planet if the meteors hit? or whatever it is, if we define what our goal is, what our vision for space is, that will at least start us down the path and help us identify what are the ways and means to get to that end result, or at least to go towards it. The problem is we're kind of flailing now. We don't really know what we want. And so it's hard to say, these are the things we should be doing. So for example, and this is my opinion, not the opinion of the U.S. Space Force, if our goal is simply the expansion of humanity, let's get off Earth, let's preserve the Earth's resources, let's get our industry off the Earth, what better way to do that than to cooperate with China, another growing space power that has a lot of those same interests. On the other hand, if it's more of a, preserving national interest and American hegemony, then obviously we wouldn't want to cooperate with our competitors. And so it's once we define what our vision is, what our goal is, what we want from space and what we want to do in space, that will help define the best path. And then hopefully we make the rational choices to get down that path. I don't know if that answers the question, but
that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah. So many of your scenarios involve relationships between entities in space and entities still on Earth, sometimes conflict between the two, in other cases conflict within each one. What do you foresee being the relationship between our presence off-world and our presence remaining here on Earth?
That's a good question, and it's a complicated one. I think a lot of it depends on the process by which that happens. If and this gets back to the previous comment about what do we want in space. If we allows maybe the wrong word. If non-state actors, if the SpaceXs of the world are the first to arrive and the first to set up settlements and really kind of create their own rules for behavior, I think that's a much more likely scenario to see some sort of split or break. There's a lot of science fiction that talks about that very thing. Red Mars is a good example by Kim Stanley Robinson, where you just, over time, even not a very long time, maybe just one generation, you develop such divergent interests that, like colonies on Earth, you eventually want to separate from the imperial master because they no longer represent your interests. And so I can see that happening very much in parallel to our history. At the same time, I can also envision a scenario where it's very nation-state led. The rules, the governance are very much tied to what they are on Earth, and it becomes sort of a satellite, both figuratively and literally, of Earth governments. In which case, there's probably less likelihood of breaking away from the Earth and maybe more competition out there leading to conflict. So it really kind of depends on the path that we take to get to those situations. And of course, that assumes that we have settlements in other places, but I think we will get there, maybe not in my lifetime. So the nice thing is, most of these happen after my lifetime, so nobody can come back and say I was wrong, or they can, but I won't care.
So for people who read and appreciate your book, do you have any recommendations for parallels or other kinds of works that they might be interested in?
It depends on what they found interesting in the book. If they really liked the sort of connection of pop culture and science fiction to more academic interests, there's a lot of books out there that do this sort of thing. Dan Dresner has a book that ties international relations theories to zombies. There's a couple of books that tie Star Wars and Game of Thrones to strategy. There's, Harry Potter, Wizarding World and International Relations book. I mean, there's a lot of books that do that sort of thing. And that was sort of how I pitched this book to the publishers. It would be in that vein and have an audience that already exists. If their interest is more in like just the science fiction part of it, I talk about a lot of books in there that I would recommend people read, some of which are fairly popular, books that almost everybody has at least heard of or read, Ender's Game and Starship Troopers, things like that. There's a lot of modern books that I reference, like Three Body Problem and Seven Eves. But there's also a lot of lesser known books and short stories and things that if these resonate, if the ideas in the book resonate with folks, I'd recommend they dive into some of that science fiction. There's a lot of science fiction that I didn't get into that even since writing this, I'm like, oh, I wish I had, read this book before writing it, because I would have incorporated it into that chapter. But at some point you have to stop and send it into the publisher and hope for the best. There's a lot of good works on international relations out there. I cite some of them in the book. And it kind of depends on which worldview someone's interested in, right? There's a lot of scholarship on realism, liberalism, all of these worldviews. There's tons of scholarship. And I cite some of them in a book that I think is either most accessible or most relevant to the arguments I'm making in the book, but there's a lot more out there, obviously.
Well, Dr. Miller, your book is such an amazing work, and I've really enjoyed our time together today. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
No, just thank you for having me. Thanks to NSSI for, first of all, nominating the book or giving the book, putting the book on the awards list. That was unexpected and much appreciated. I'm thankful to come out here and talk to the folks here, and to have this opportunity to talk about the book. I didn't write it with that in mind. I wrote it hopefully to be useful to people that are teaching this or thinking about it. And if even one person tells me they've read it, I see that as a huge win over what I expected. So, no, I appreciate this and appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Well, on behalf of the NSSI and our faculty and staff, thank you for taking the time to join us as part of our speaker series, to speak to us in person, and also joining us for this fireside chat. Well, and again, thank you so much. Appreciate you taking your time to be with us here today.
Thank you. My pleasure.